The Assyrians once ruled an empire that stretched across deserts, mountains, and fertile plains. Yet today their name lingers mostly in fragments of stone and whispered memory. To many, Assyria is a shadowy presence in the past, remembered for its kings with long beards and stern eyes carved into walls, for armies that marched with iron discipline, and for punishments so severe they seemed designed to terrify the world. But the empire was also a place of ordinary lives, of farmers tending fields beneath scorching suns, of women drawing water from rivers, of children laughing in the narrow streets of Nineveh and Ashur. When we step into the forgotten world of the Assyrians, we enter a land both magnificent and harsh. Their palaces loomed above subjects like mountains of stone, adorned with carvings that told endless stories of conquest and power. Yet beyond those walls, the people lived with hunger, toil, and fear, surviving in the shadow of kings who claimed divine favor. The Assyrian world was one of great contrasts between splendor and struggle, glory and cruelty, power and fragility. This is not simply a tale of kings and battles. It is also a quiet story of survival, of how people endured in a world where punishment was swift. War was constant, and the gods demanded reverence. To understand Assyria is to see both the grandeur of empire and the humanity beneath it, where even in the midst of fear, families built lives, worshipped, and hoped. In this calm journey, we will uncover the palaces, the punishments, and the daily rhythms of Assyrian life, piecing together a civilization often remembered only for its cruelty, but which was also home to ordinary people who lived, struggled, and endured. Part 1. In the shadow of Nineveh. The first light of dawn brushes the walls of Nineveh, the great Assyrian city, and the stones seem to drink in the warmth of the rising sun. High walls stand like guardians, their reliefs and carvings filled with winged creatures, lions, and kings who never age. From a distance, Nineveh looks less like a city and more like a promise of permanence, a place that believes it can resist the erosion of time. Yet within those walls, life is already stirring in ways that feel familiar, even across the centuries. The air smells faintly of clay and smoke. Potters who worked late into the night have left their kilns smoldering, and thin threads of smoke drift lazily upward. From narrow alleys, one can hear the slap of sandals on baked earth as men and women begin their day's labor. There is no stillness in Nineveh for long. This was the capital of kings who ruled with iron, and so the pulse of the city beats early and strong, as if to remind all within that they live in the presence of power. If you were a farmer, arriving at Nineveh's gates with a cart of grain or dates, you might look up at those walls with awe and dread. The gates themselves were decorated with colossal figures, winged bulls with human faces, known as lamassu, designed not only to guard but to impress upon every visitor the might of Assyria. To step beneath their gaze was to feel small, as though one's very thoughts were being weighed. Yet the guards at the gate, wrapped in wool and leather armor, cared little for grandeur. They checked your wares, collected the tax, and waved you through. For them, this was routine. For you, it was a moment to measure your place in the world. Inside, Nineveh was alive with contrast. Wide avenues led to palaces so large they could swallow entire villages, their walls painted in bright colors, their courtyards filled with fountains and carved stone lions. But beyond those avenues, the city narrowed into twisting lanes where children ran barefoot, where laundry hung between mud brick houses, and where the rhythm of daily survival was never far from the surface. Women carried clay jars on their heads, balancing them with a grace born of necessity. Some made their way toward the Tigris River, where the city drew its lifeblood of water. Others brought bread to market, the loaves wrapped in cloth, still warm from the oven. Bakers themselves could be found in their shops, pulling flat rounds from clay ovens heated by smoldering dung. The smell of bread drifted through the air, mingling with the sharper scent of onions and garlic. The palace loomed above it all. From the street, you might catch only glimpses: tall walls of stone, gates that led into shaded courtyards, a roofline that seemed to stretch forever. For the common people, the palace was more legend than reality. They knew its rooms were vast and filled with treasures, golden vessels, carved thrones, walls painted with scenes of kings, hunting lions, or leading armies. But for most, the palace was simply a reminder. The king is always watching, even if unseen. In the marketplace, voices rose and fell in steady rhythm. Merchants unrolled bolts of cloth dyed deep red or pale blue. Copper workers displayed tools and jewelry, their hands stained with soot. Traders arriving from distant lands offered goods that seemed almost magical ivory, lapis lazuli, spices carried from mountains and deserts. The marketplace was more than commerce. It was a meeting place of the empire where whispers traveled as quickly as coins changed hands. News of battles, rumors of rebellions, and edicts of the king spread here, retold in quiet tones between sips of beer. Life in Nineveh was lived under the shadow of greatness, but it was also lived in small acts of endurance. A child leading a goat through the street had no thought for the empire's reach. He was concerned only with guiding the animal safely to pasture. A woman pounding grain in her courtyard thought less of distant wars than of feeding her family. A scribe copying lines of cuneiform might daydream about the coolness of shade rather than the destiny of kings. Great cities survived because of these ordinary lives, layered one upon another like bricks forming a wall. Still, power pressed close. Punishment in Assyria was harsh, and people knew it. Soldiers patrolled the streets, their bronze weapons glinting, their eyes watchful. The empire thrived on obedience, and disobedience was not tolerated. Whispers of cruel punishments, floggings, mutilations, impalement traveled like shadows through the alleys. Even if one never saw such punishments, the idea of them was enough to keep order. It was a city held together by awe, by fear, and by the ordinary need to survive. Yet amid all this, life carried its own rhythms. At midday, when the sun blazed too hot, the streets quieted. Merchants pulled cloth canopies over their stalls, and families retreated to the coolness of shaded courtyards. Water was poured over clay floors to settle dust and bring a momentary coolness. Children napped, curled on mats woven of reeds, and when the heat softened, life returned. Once more voices lifted, footsteps echoed, and Nineveh's pulse beat again. At dusk, lamps flickered to life in the doorways of homes. Small oil lamps cast golden halos, their flames swaying gently with the evening breeze. In courtyards, families gathered to share bread, lentils, and beer. The day's labors were recounted, and laughter broke through the seriousness of life. Even in an empire famed for its severity, there were moments of tenderness, parents stroking the heads of children, neighbors sharing food, friends raising clay cups in quiet toasts. Night in Nineveh carried a different voice. The streets fell silent, except for the occasional bark of dogs or the call of a watchman. Above, the stars stretched across the sky, clear and countless. From the palace walls, priests studied their patterns, seeking omens and divine messages. To the Assyrians, the heavens were not distant. They were a text, written by the gods, waiting to be read. For the ordinary person lying on a reed mat, the stars were simply a comfort, silent witnesses to another day survived. To walk through Nineveh in imagination is to feel both awe and humility. The city was the heart of an empire, but it was also a patchwork of ordinary lives of bakers, potters, farmers, children. It was a place of grandeur and fear, but also of routine and resilience. Every brick, every alley, every lamp lit at night was a part of a larger story, one that reminds us that, even in the shadow of kings and empires, life was lived in small, enduring rhythms. And so, as we linger in the shadow of Nineveh, we begin to see not only the empire's power, but also the people who gave it life. Tomorrow would bring the same struggles and the same hopes, the same fear of punishment, and the same laughter of children. In this balance between splendor and survival lay the forgotten world of the Assyrians. Part 2. palaces of power. If the alleys and courtyards of Nineveh carried the heartbeat of ordinary life, the palaces were its face turned toward the heavens. They were not simply dwellings for kings. They were proclamations in stone and brick, statements meant to outlast the very breath of those who built them. To walk near the palace walls was to feel the weight of the Assyrian idea of kingship, absolute, divine, and enduring. The most famous of these palaces was the one built by King Sennacherib. To his people, he was more than a ruler. He was the hand of the gods upon the earth. His palace was called the Palace Without Rival, and for those who saw it, the name seemed justified. Imagine vast courtyards paved with stone, where columns rose like trees in a forest of power. Imagine walls stretching for hundreds of feet, covered not in blank stone, but in carvings so detailed that they told entire history's armies, marching, kings, hunting lions, cities burning, captives kneeling. To enter such a place was to be reminded that your own life, however precious, was small compared to the machinery of empire. The reliefs themselves were more than decoration. They were messages, each scene carefully chosen. The lion hunt, for example, was not simply sport. It was a performance of dominance, showing the king as the tamer of chaos, the one who could bring order to wildness. To see the king standing over a fallen lion, spear in hand, was to see the balance of the world dramatized in stone. The king strong, chaos subdued. Inside the palace, corridors stretched like veins, carrying one deeper into the heart of power. The air would have been cooler, shaded from the Assyrian sun. Servants moved quietly, carrying water in clay jars, polishing bronze, preparing meals in kitchens that smoked with roasting meat. Palace life was its own ecosystem, one that existed parallel to the city, but not fully part of it. The throne room stood at the center of it all, a space designed to overwhelm. The throne itself was carved of precious woods, inlaid with ivory and gold, raised upon a dais so that even as one approached, one looked up. Behind it, the walls were carved with scenes of victory's armies returning with plunder, foreign kings bowing low, gods offering their blessing to the Assyrian monarch. The effect was deliberate, to remind every ambassador, general, or servant who entered that they stood not before a man but before an institution, a sacred embodiment of rule. But beyond the spectacle, the palace also functioned as the empire's brain. Here, scribes worked tirelessly, their reed styluses pressing marks into clay tablets that recorded everything from tribute payments to battle reports. Hundreds, even thousands of tablets were stored in archives, each one a fragment of the empire's memory. The palace was not only decorated with reliefs, it was filled with words, with laws, with records of who had given what and who had failed. To live under Assyrian power was to live under observation, a reminder that the king's knowledge stretched far beyond what one could see. The scale of the palace was staggering. Some estimates suggest Sennacherib's palace had nearly 80 rooms, each decorated, each serving a function. Reception halls, private chambers, storerooms filled with tribute from conquered lands' gold, silver, exotic animals, cedar wood from distant mountains. The palace was a museum of empire, each object telling the story of conquest. A visitor could walk past statues of winged bulls taller than any man, or touch doors made of bronze, engraved with patterns so intricate they seemed alive. Yet for all its grandeur, palace life also carried shadows. To serve in such a place meant living constantly under the eye of authority. Servants who brought water to the king or prepared his meals knew that the smallest failure could bring punishment. Guards who lined the hallways stood not only to protect but also to remind. Power in Assyria was magnificent, but it was also edged with fear. There were rituals, too, that kept the palace bound to the divine. Priests and diviners were constant presences, reading omens, offering sacrifices, ensuring that the king's actions aligned with the will of the gods. In the evenings, when lamps flickered in the halls, priests might sprinkle water drawn from sacred rivers, muttering prayers in voices low and steady. To them, the palace was not only a seat of human power, but also a bridge to the heavens. If the king faltered in the gods' eyes, the entire empire trembled. Outside the palace gates, people gathered not only to marvel, but also to plead. Petitioners arrived with complaints, with requests, with offerings. Some came seeking justice, others mercy. They stood in courtyards or waited in side chambers, hoping their words might reach ears that could change their fate. For them, the palace was both hope and terror, a place where one's life could be altered in an instant. And yet, despite all this grandeur, the palace was not invincible. Time erodes, even stone. Fires could sweep through chambers, destroying wooden beams, blackening walls. Enemies could breach gates, looting treasures once thought eternal. Today, archaeologists uncover the remains, broken reliefs, shattered statues, fragments of tablets, reminders that what once felt permanent was, in truth, fragile. But in its prime, the palace stood as the heart of Nineveh, the symbol of all Assyria's ambitions. From here, orders went out to armies that marched across deserts and mountains. From here, tribute poured in from cities along the Mediterranean. From valleys of the Levant, from lands as distant as Egypt, the palace was not only stone and brick, it was the axis upon which much of the known world seemed to turn. As night fell, lamps lit the halls with a golden glow. Shadows of winged bulls stretched long across the floors, as though the guardians themselves prowled silently. The king might recline in his private chamber, musicians plucking lyres, servants fanning the air. While beyond the palace walls, Nineveh's streets grew dark and quiet. But even in that stillness, the palace remained awake, scribes continuing their work, guards pacing, priests whispering prayers to unseen gods. For those who lived outside, the palace was a dream, something glimpsed but never truly entered. For those who lived within, it was a cage of grandeur, heavy with expectation. To understand the Assyrians is to understand this duality, the palace as glory and the palace as burden. It was a place that shaped lives far beyond its walls, commanding obedience, inspiring awe, and embodying the empire's fragile dream of permanence. And so, we leave the courtyards glowing in lamplight, carved lions staring eternally from the walls, the quiet rustle of clay tablets being pressed with fresh words. The palace stands, unyielding in the night, even as beyond its gates, the ordinary city breathes its slower rhythms. One world of splendor and command, the other of bread and survival. Together, they form the empire's heart, each incomplete without the other. Part 3. Punishments and Control. Beyond the grandeur of palaces and the hum of bustling streets lay another face of Assyria, one that governed not through beauty or architecture, but through fear, order, and consequence. The empire, after all, did not stretch so far, nor endure so long, by chance. It survived by weaving together two threads: loyalty inspired by awe, and obedience secured by punishment. To live in Assyria was to know both. The Assyrians believed deeply in authority. Kings called themselves shepherds of their people, yet the rod they carried was often heavier than the staff of care. Punishments in Assyria were not simply penalties for wrongdoing. They were spectacles, reminders to all of what happened when order was broken. These acts of control echoed through both the ordinary streets and the imposing halls of government, ensuring that fear lingered like incense in the air. In the marketplaces of Nineveh or Ashur, one might see the results of this system in quiet, almost ordinary ways. A thief caught stealing grain might be paraded through the streets, his crime announced aloud for all to hear. Punishment could range from restitution to harsh physical pain, depending on the severity and the will of local authorities. To witness such a scene was to be reminded that justice was not distant, it stood close, watching. More severe crimes, however, were met with punishments that today might seem unimaginable. Exile, mutilation, and death were not uncommon. The Assyrian state was built on conquest, and its leaders believed that order could only be maintained if disobedience was crushed swiftly and visibly. When rebellion broke out in distant provinces, captured leaders might be brought to Nineveh, There in front of the palace gates, they could be executed, their bodies displayed as warnings. To see a rebel king bound in chains, humiliated before the Assyrian throne, was to see the empire's message written not in words but in flesh. The severity of Assyrian justice extended even within its military ranks. Soldiers who deserted, who disobeyed commands, or who shirked their duties faced dire consequences. In a world where armies were the backbone of the empire, disobedience was a threat to survival. To maintain discipline, commanders wielded authority with little hesitation. Punishment in such cases was not only retribution but a lesson to others. For ordinary people, fear of punishment shaped daily choices. Farmers who failed to deliver their share of grain risked more than a reprimand. Artisans who did not meet quotas faced penalties that could cost them their livelihood. Even families were not immune. Punishment could extend to wives, children, or relatives, binding entire households to obedience. In this way, power became generational, as fear was passed down like inheritance. But punishment in Assyria was not only physical, it was also symbolic, performed in ways that touched the soul as well as the body. One might be forced into labor far from home, cutting stone for palaces or digging canals in distant provinces. Such exile separated people from their families, their communities, their gods. It was punishment through dislocation, a tearing away of roots. The Assyrians also believed that the gods themselves played a role in justice. Priests, diviners, and oracles could be called upon to determine guilt. Through omens, sacrifices, or rituals, they interpreted the will of the divine. A trial might not be decided solely by human judgment, but by signs from the heavens. In this way, punishment became not just a matter of law, but of cosmic order. To disobey the king was to disobey the gods. And yet, within this harshness, one finds another layer. Punishment, while severe, was also part of maintaining balance. The Assyrians lived in a world of uncertainty, floods, droughts, invading enemies, plagues. To them, order was fragile, always threatened. Punishment was the mechanism that kept chaos at bay, ensuring that the empire endured another day. It was harsh, but in their eyes, necessary. In the royal inscriptions carved into stone or clay, Assyrian kings often boasted of their punishments. They described how rebels were flayed, how enemies were executed, how cities that resisted were destroyed. These inscriptions, however, were not diaries of cruelty, they were propaganda. Their purpose was to project strength, to warn those who might think of disobedience. The Assyrian ruler to show mercy in writing would be to invite rebellion. It's better to carve into stone the image of severity, even if daily life carried more shades of quiet governance. The people, of course, lived in the space between fear and endurance. They whispered stories, perhaps of cruel punishments, passing them down as cautionary tales. They reminded their children of the importance of obedience, of respect, of staying within the lines of expectation. Fear, in this sense, became part of culture itself, a way of shaping behavior long before punishments were ever required. But punishment also reinforced divisions. Those at the top wielded power. Those below bore the weight of it. Kings and nobles could command with authority, secure in the knowledge that their word could not be challenged. Commoners, artisans, and farmers lived with an ever-present awareness that one misstep might bring ruin. In this way, punishment was not only about crime, it was about hierarchy, reminding each person of their place. At times, however, punishment was tempered by ritual and forgiveness. Certain festivals or sacred days might bring amnesty, as kings sought to show their mercy alongside their power. In such moments, prisoners might be released, debts forgiven, penalties lightened. These acts were not simply kindness, they were political, designed to strengthen loyalty, to remind people that the king was not only punisher but protector. If one imagines a quiet evening in Nineveh, the contrast becomes vivid. In one part of the city, a family prepares bread, the smell of baking filling their small courtyard. Children play with clay toys, laughter drifting into the air. Yet just beyond, perhaps near the palace gates, a prisoner is displayed as warning, his fate a reminder of the consequences of disobedience. Life in Assyria was always lived under the shadow of punishment, even in its most ordinary moments. Archaeologists uncover fragments of this system tablets recording fines, decrees outlining penalties, reliefs depicting captives. These artifacts, though silent now, once carried the weight of life and death. A single mark on clay could determine a man's fate, while a carving on a wall could teach generations the cost of resistance. The Assyrian Empire, vast and powerful, was held together not only by armies and palaces, but by these invisible threads of fear and control. And yet, we should not imagine the Assyrians as uniquely cruel, nor their punishments as alien. In truth, they were part of the logic of ancient empires everywhere. Egypt, Babylon, Persia wielded punishment as a tool of power. What makes the Assyrians stand out is the clarity with which they displayed it, inscribing it into the very stones of their cities, leaving little to doubt about how authority functioned. So, as we walk again through the streets of Nineveh in our imagination, we carry both sides of this memory. On one hand, the laughter of children, the rhythm of merchants calling out their wares, the smell of bread. On the other, the shadow of punishment, quiet, heavy, a constant presence. To be Assyrian was to live between these poles, surviving not only by skill and labor, but by knowing where not to step, what not to say, whom not to displease. As the lamps are lit in the city and the palace stands glowing in the distance, the people retreat into their homes, their doors barred against the night. The punishments of the day, whether seen or only heard of, linger in their thoughts. Sleep comes, as it always does. But even in dreams, the memory of fear shapes the mind. And in the morning, as the sun rises over the Tigris, life begins again ordered, controlled, fragile, and enduring. Part 4. Ordinary Survival. In the shadow of the great walls of Nineveh, amid the echoing orders of kings and the whispers of scribes. Life for most Assyrians was not defined by palaces or punishments, but by the soft rhythm of ordinary survival. When the dawn broke over the Tigris, its light falling across mud-brick houses clustered along narrow lanes, families stirred to begin their daily tasks. The monumental reliefs in the royal halls may have celebrated victories and brutal conquests. The life of the commoner moved according to other victories, small ones, private ones that unfolded each day. The survival of a child past to infancy, the successful gathering of barley, the weaving of a garment that would last through another winter, these were the quiet. Triumphs unrecorded in stone, yet just as vital. The Assyrian landscape offered both challenge and opportunity. The rivers brought fertility, but also flooding. The soil could be generous, but demanded constant work. Ordinary families depended on agriculture, as they had for generations, sowing fields of wheat, barley, and lentils under a punishing sun. Men guided plows pulled by oxen, their bodies bent and hardened by years of labor, while women and children gleaned behind them, collecting what was missed. Farming was uncertain. Pests or war could strip away a year's hopes, but it remained the anchor of life. To live in Assyria was to accept the unpredictability of the earth and still press forward year after year. In towns and villages, craftsmen and traders formed another rhythm of survival. Potters turned clay on simple wheels, shaping jars and bowls that would be used in kitchens or carried to markets. Weavers sat for long hours at looms, their fingers nimble as they turned flax or wool into cloth. Metal workers hammered bronze and iron into tools, weapons, and household items, their fires glowing late into the night. Markets themselves were noisy gatherings of survival where people bartered grain for fish or cloth for oil, each exchange keeping the fragile balance of community life intact. Food, always at the center of survival, was modest but sustaining. Bread, coarse and dark, filled most meals, often accompanied by lentil stew or onions. Those living near rivers might add fish, while wealthier households could afford meat from goats or sheep. Dates, figs, and pomegranates sweetened life when available, though for many they were rare luxuries. Beer, brewed from barley, was the common drink, nourishing and filling, a reminder that even in hardship, comfort could be found in the simplest of cups. Survival also required resilience in the face of hardship. Disease could strike without warning, claiming young and old alike. Families relied on herbal remedies, charms, and the prayers of priests to ward off illness. Women bore the heavy duty of childbirth, an event surrounded by both hope and fear, for it could bring new life or sudden death. Yet through loss, families endured, binding themselves together with traditions, rituals, and stories passed down like heirlooms more precious than gold. Children, though born into a world of constant uncertainty, found joy in play and discovery. They fashioned toys from clay, sticks, and scraps of wood, chasing one another through dusty streets. They learned early the skills of their parents' boys guided animals, or practiced with small tools, while girls helped grind grain or weave. Education for most was practical, centered on survival, but some boys, especially from wealthier families, might enter the world of scribes, scratching signs into clay tablets, their knowledge opening paths closed to most.
Ow.
Religion wove itself into every moment of ordinary survival.
Ow.
The great temples of Ashur and Ishtar might have loomed above cities, but in small homes, families lit small fires or whispered prayers to household gods. Clay figurines of protective spirits stood in corners, guarding against misfortune. Each harvest was not only labor but ritual, each illness not only suffering but a test of divine favor. Ordinary Assyrians, who had little power against the commands of kings or the shifts of empire, found steadiness in these daily acts of belief, trusting that unseen forces guided their fragile lives. Even leisure, rare as it was, formed part of survival. Music, played on flutes, drums, or lyres, drifted through villages during festivals. Dancing, storytelling, and shared meals gave relief from hardship, weaving bonds of community.
Ease.
These gatherings were not frivolous escapes but necessary releases. Reminders that survival meant more than endurance. It also meant remembering joy, however fleeting. For women, survival carried unique burdens and quiet strengths. They managed households, oversaw food preparation, and cared for children. Some worked as weavers, midwives, or even tavern keepers, roles that provided small independence within a patriarchal society. In marriage, they were often seen as extensions of family alliances, yet within homes they carried authority, keeping families alive when men went to war or fields. Their labor, often unrecorded by scribes, was the silent foundation of Assyrian society. Survival also extended into the relationship between humans and animals. Oxen, donkeys, and goats were not only work or food, they were companions in labor, woven into the rhythms of family life. Shepherds led flocks across hills, their whistles and calls echoing across the landscape. Their days as long and arduous as those of farmers. Dogs guarded homes, while cats prowled kitchens, keeping pests at bay. Each animal, large or small, contributed to the fragile fabric of daily endurance. Yet always, in the background of ordinary life, loomed the shadow of empire. Taxes demanded by kings, levies of men for military service, and sudden calls for labor on royal projects could disrupt survival in an instant. Families might see sons marched off to distant wars, or fields abandoned for state-building works. And yet ordinary Assyrians adapted, finding ways to carry on. The resilience of survival lay not in resisting the empire, but in bending with its demands while still preserving the daily rituals of food, family, and faith. In quiet evenings, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the heat of the day faded, families gathered at doorsteps or rooftops. They shared meals, recounted stories, and gazed at the same stars that shone over palaces and battlefields alike. These moments, simple and unrecorded, held the true essence of survival. The Assyrian Empire might have risen and fallen on the tides of conquest, but it was these evenings of bread and song, of whispered prayers and children's laughter that kept its heart beating across centuries. Ordinary survival in Assyria was not glorious, nor was it easy. It was humble, repetitive, and vulnerable. Yet it was precisely this survival, the patience of farmers, the craft of artisans, the care of mothers, the laughter of children that gave meaning to the empire's grandeur. Without them, no king could have raised a palace, no army could have marched, no empire could have endured. The reliefs carved into stone celebrated battles, but the real monument of Assyria lay in the quiet persistence of its people, who, through hunger, toil, and hope, found ways to keep life alive beneath the weight of empire. Part 5. Faith in Temples. The Burden of the Gods. The Assyrian world was one of stone, bronze and blood, but also of incense, hymns, and divine shadows that seemed to hover over every aspect of life. If the palaces of kings expressed human might, then the temples of Assyria proclaimed a different kind of authority, that of the gods themselves. Rising in tiered steps or standing tall with painted facades, temples and ziggurats dominated the skyline of Assyrian cities like Nineveh, Asor, and Nimrod. To live in Assyria was to live under the watchful eyes of beings who were believed to control the sun, the rivers, the crops, and the very destiny of kings. The faith of the Assyrians was not gentle. It was not a religion of quiet reflection or tender compassion. Instead, it was a faith of command and obligation, demanding sacrifice, discipline, and constant appeasement. Just as the Assyrian king ruled his subjects, so too did the gods rule the king, binding all people in a chain of duty. At the head of this divine order was Oshur, the chief god of the Assyrians. More than just a deity, he was the embodiment of the empire itself. To serve Oshur was to serve Assyria, and conquest became not merely political ambition, but a sacred mission. When armies marched, they marched under his standard. When kings carved their victories into stone, they credited not their own courage but the will of Ashur. To resist Assyria was, in the Assyrian worldview, to resist the god himself. Yet Ashur was not the only divine presence shaping life. The goddess Ishtar, fierce and paradoxical, embodied both love and war. She was invoked by soldiers before battle, by lovers in the secrecy of their chambers, and by farmers who prayed for fertile harvests. Then there was Shamash, the sun god, whose justice was seen in the rising of the dawn and the balance of cosmic order. Nabu, the god of wisdom and writing, patron of scribes, gave legitimacy to royal decrees and to the records etched into clay tablets. Each deity had their priests, their rituals, their temples filled with offerings of food, drink, and precious metals. For the ordinary Assyrian, life was deeply intertwined with this divine hierarchy. Every harvest owed thanks to the gods. Every illness or misfortune hinted at divine displeasure. Dreams could be omens, and eclipses could herald disaster. The people lived not only under the rule of kings, but under a constant awareness that their actions were weighed and measured by beings beyond mortal sight. Inside the temples, priests maintained a strict and sacred order. These were not quiet sanctuaries, but places alive with smoke, chants, and movement. Ritual fires burned and sacrifices of animals were made, their blood flowing onto stone altars in acts of devotion and appeasement. The priests, trained in ritual precision, read omens from the entrails of sheep or from the movements of the stars. Their role was not only religious but political, for they were the interpreters of the god's will. A favorable omen could justify a campaign, while a troubling one could delay a king's ambitions. In this way, the fate of the empire was thought to lie in the subtle signs of the heavens and the careful readings of sacred texts. The burden of the gods was felt most heavily by the king. He was not seen as divine himself, but as the chosen servant of Ashur, bearing responsibility for the empire's victories, its prosperity, and its piety. If Assyria faltered, it was not only his political failure, but his religious one. This is why kings were so eager to record their triumphs as the will of the gods, and to erect temples and ziggurats alongside palaces. To rule Assyria was to constantly prove one's devotion and legitimacy before both men and gods. Consider the great ziggurat of Nimrod, towering in its day like a man-made mountain. To ascend its steps was to symbolically climb toward the heavens, to bridge the world of mortals with the realm of the divine. Rituals performed there were not meant only for private devotion, but to reaffirm the very order of the universe. Festivals celebrated the cycles of the seasons, reenacting myths of death and rebirth, ensuring that the natural world continued in harmony with divine will. But while the splendor of temples and rituals may suggest comfort and stability, faith also weighed heavily on ordinary people. To neglect offerings, to skip rituals, to disrespect the temple was to invite misfortune not only upon oneself, but upon family and community. Fear of divine wrath was ever present. When drought struck, people wondered which god had been offended. When enemies attacked, it was questioned whether a ritual had been forgotten or a sacrifice made in error. The divine was never far away, but neither was the anxiety it brought. Women, too, participated in these rituals, offering prayers for childbirth, fertility, and family safety. Children were taught early the stories of the gods, the importance of festivals, and the proper way to show reverence. The rhythm of daily life was punctuated by moments of devotion. A whispered prayer before planting, an offering left at a household shrine, a ritual meal during the great festivals. Religion was not a separate sphere, but woven seamlessly into survival, politics, and war. The Assyrian gods also reflected the empire's own duality. Just as the kings could be both protectors and oppressors, so too could the gods be generous or ruthless. Ishtar might bless with love and abundance one day, and demand blood on the battlefield the next. Ashur could bring victory, but also punish weakness with defeat. Faith was not comfort, it was a contract. The people gave devotion, sacrifice, and obedience, and in return they hoped for prosperity, security, and divine favor. But the gods were not bound by human expectations, and this uncertainty shaped an Assyrian mindset of vigilance and submission. The empire's vast power was mirrored in the scale of its religious ceremonies. When a great victory was won, it was celebrated not only with feasts and spoils, but with massive rituals thanking the gods. Captives and tribute might be paraded through city streets before being presented at temple gates. Festivals became both religious and political theater, demonstrating the unity of people under gods and king. In this sense, temples were as much instruments of control as palaces. They bound people together through shared belief and ritual, creating a powerful sense of order, but also reinforcing the hierarchy that placed gods above all, kings beneath them, and subjects at the base. Yet within this weight of obligation, there was also comfort. To pray to Ishtar in the darkness of night, to see the sunrise as the face of Shamash, to believe that every action was part of a cosmic plan, these beliefs gave meaning to hardship. They explained why empires rose and fell, why fortunes shifted, why death came suddenly. For an Assyrian farmer or soldier, the gods offered not only demands, but also a framework that made the chaos of existence bearable. And so, when the people looked upon the ziggurats, they did not only see stone, they saw a link between earth and heaven, a promise that their struggles and sacrifices were noticed by powers greater than themselves. Faith bound them, burdened them, and at times uplifted them. It was the unseen architecture of their world, as essential as walls and gates, as real as kings and armies. In this way, the Assyrian Empire was not only built on conquest and labor, but on belief. Its soldiers fought not only for territory, but under divine command. Its kings ruled not only through law, but by claiming sacred sanction. Its people endured not only through strength, but by the hope that the gods, demanding as they were, still watched and guided. This was the Assyrian burden of faith, to live knowing that every victory and every sorrow was tied to powers beyond sight. To accept that the gods who gave life also demanded endless devotion, and to find meaning within that cycle of sacrifice and survival. The stones of their temples have long since crumbled, and the gods of Assyria no longer have worshippers. Yet for centuries, they shaped every heartbeat of the empire, reminding us that the Assyrian story was not only written in conquest and cruelty, but also in devotion, belief, and the eternal search for divine favor. Part 6. Soldiers of Ashur. Life in the Assyrian army. The Assyrian Empire was forged not only with stone and faith, but with iron and blood. To speak of Assyria is to speak of its armies, the relentless force that carried its banners across Mesopotamia, Syria, Anatolia, and into the mountains of Elam. These armies were the living embodiment of Ashur's will, instruments through which the gods themselves were believed to extend their dominion. For the Assyrian soldier, daily life was not merely survival. It was duty, ritual, and endless preparation for campaigns that could stretch far beyond the horizon. Unlike many civilizations, where armies were raised only in times of crisis, the Assyrians built one of the first professional standing armies in history. Soldiers were not temporary levies, but lifelong instruments of war. They trained, lived, and marched under the constant expectation that the empire's survival and expansion depended on their readiness. From the villages of farmers to the gates of Nineveh, young men were drawn into this machine of conquest. For some, service was compulsory. For others, it offered a chance for spoils and recognition in a rigid society. A typical day for an Assyrian soldier began not in battle, but in discipline. At sunrise, units assembled for drills, their shields polished and spears lined in order. Officers barked commands while formations shifted with precision. The phalanx like lines, the archers behind them, the cavalry on their flanks, every movement was practiced until instinct replaced hesitation. The Assyrian army did not rely on courage alone, but on the cold efficiency of drilled order. Soldiers were tools, sharpened and ready, each playing a role in the larger machinery of empire. Weapons were both personal and sacred. The sword, often iron by the height of Assyrian power, was a soldier's lifeline. Spears provided reach, while bows, perfected in design, gave Assyria unmatched range in ancient warfare. Cavalrymen carried lances and bows, combining speed and impact. Chariots, once the pride of Mesopotamian battlefields, still had their place in grand spectacles of war, though cavalry gradually replaced them for practical use. Armor was not uniform, but depended on rank and role. Some wore scale armor of bronze or iron, others leather or padded cloth. Helmets gleamed and shields bore emblems that reflected divine protection. But beyond weapons and armor, faith remained central. Before campaigns, rituals were performed. Priests consulted omens, inspecting the entrails of sacrificed animals, reading the stars, or observing the flight of birds. Soldiers did not march merely because a king commanded it. They marched because the gods decreed it. Each step carried with it a sense of cosmic duty. To fight bravely was to honor Ashur. To falter was to dishonor both king and god. This belief gave the army a fervor that was as psychological as it was physical. Life on campaign was harsh. Soldiers endured blistering heat across deserts, biting cold in mountain passes, and hunger when supply lines faltered. They carried rations of grain and dried meat, supplemented by whatever could be taken from the land. Camps were organized with discipline, tents arranged in rows. Guards posted through the night, fires carefully placed to avoid detection or waste. Each soldier's role was defined not only in battle, but in camp. Some dug trenches, others cared for horses, while others maintained weapons. Order was survival, and survival ensured conquest. Yet there was also camaraderie. Brothers in arms shared bread, stories, and the endless weariness of marching. Bonds formed between men who faced the same dangers and endured the same burdens. Songs were sung, sometimes hymns to Ishtar or Ashur, sometimes simple chants to keep rhythm during long marches. These small moments of humanity pierced the otherwise grueling rhythm of soldiering. When battle finally came, it was a clash of noise, dust, and fear. The Assyrians, however, approached war as calculated theater. Siege warfare became their hallmark. They built massive siege engines, battering rams reinforced with iron, towers that loomed over enemy walls, and ramps constructed by thousands of laborers under arrow fire. Archers rained volleys to cover the advance, while shield bearers created walls of protection. Engineers worked with soldiers in unison, demonstrating that Assyrian war was not just brute force, but advanced organization. For the soldier, standing beneath the walls of a besieged city meant facing not only enemy missiles but boiling oil, burning torches, and desperation from within. Yet they pressed forward, knowing that retreat was often punished more severely than death in battle. When walls finally fell, chaos erupted. Soldiers surged into the breach, and what followed was often brutal. Looting, the capture of prisoners, and harsh punishments were not aberrations, but deliberate strategies meant to terrify future enemies into submission without resistance. The rewards of war were real, but unequal. High-ranking officers and nobles claimed the lion's share of treasure, but common soldiers might gain a portion of plunder, livestock, tools, or even captives. These spoils supplemented their otherwise meager existence, offering an incentive to fight fiercely. Victory also meant glory inscribed in stone. Kings carved their campaigns into palace walls, showing soldiers storming cities, leading captives, or kneeling before Asher symbols. Though individual names were seldom remembered, the collective image of the Assyrian army was immortalized in reliefs that still survive. Fear, however, was a constant companion. To live as a soldier was to live with the possibility of sudden death from enemy arrows, disease in the camps, or punishment from one's own officers. Discipline was merciless. Cowardice, desertion, or failure to obey orders could result in mutilation or execution. The Assyrian military machine allowed no weakness, and the knowledge of brutal consequences kept soldiers in line as much as loyalty or belief. Despite the harshness, the army was a path to power. Generals and commanders often rose from the ranks, their success on the battlefield granting them political influence. Even common soldiers might find honor in their communities upon returning from campaigns, bringing with them stories of far-off lands and victories won. Yet such returns were rare, for the army was almost constantly on campaign, and many men spent most of their adult lives marching, fighting, and dying far from home. The presence of foreign soldiers also shaped the army. Conquered peoples were often conscripted, serving as auxiliaries or laborers. This created a diverse fighting force, with men from many cultures fighting under the Assyrian banner. While this added strength, it also demanded constant oversight to prevent rebellion or desertion. Still, the Assyrians managed to mold this diversity into effectiveness, another mark of their ruthless efficiency. The shadow of the Helots defined Sparta, Assyria. It was the constant memory of past rebellions and enemies waiting at the borders. Soldiers carried not only weapons, but the weight of empire itself, knowing that failure on their part could unravel the fragile dominance maintained by fear. Each campaign was both expansion and necessity, ensuring that subject peoples remained subdued and tribute continued to flow. Perhaps most striking is how intertwined soldiers were with Assyria's identity. To be Assyrian was, in many ways, to be a soldier, or to support those who fought. Even civilians in cities felt the military presence through conscription. Through the parades of victorious troops, through the spoils of conquest displayed in temples, war was not an interruption of daily life. It was its rhythm. And so the soldiers of Ashur lived and died within a world of discipline, faith, and unending conflict. Their sweat watered the roads of conquest, their blood marked the walls of cities. Their loyalty ensured that the empire endured as long as it did. They were both instruments of terror and victims of it, bound in the cycle of violence that sustained Assyria. To imagine the life of an Assyrian soldier is to imagine a man caught between pride and fear, between glory promised by kings and gods, and the harsh reality of hunger, wounds, and endless marches. It was a life shaped by the empire's unquenchable thirst for dominance, a life both exalted and expendable. And though centuries have passed, the carvings on palace walls still whisper of these men, their discipline, their endurance, and the shadow they cast across the ancient world. Part 7. Assyrian Roads and Traders, the lifelines of empire. When we think of Assyria, the mind often pictures kings upon their thrones, soldiers in formation, or towering palaces carved with images of conquest. Yet beneath the thunder of armies and the commands of kings, another rhythm kept the empire alive: the steady passage of traders along roads that connected Nineveh, Ashur, and Nimrod to lands beyond the horizon. These roads, stretching across deserts, mountains, and fertile plains, were the true veins of the empire. Without them, armies would falter, cities would wither, and the authority of kings would crumble into dust. The Assyrians understood this with clarity. Where they conquered, they built. Roads were laid down, fortified stations were established, and couriers on horseback were stationed at intervals to carry messages swiftly. These were not simple dirt paths, but carefully maintained arteries, allowing both armies and merchants to move with surprising speed. An edict from the king could travel across the empire in days, and caravans laden with goods could bring wealth from distant lands to the heart of Nineveh. Imagine for a moment the morning at a roadside station. Soldiers stand watch by the gates, their spears glinting as the sun rises. A caravan approaches. Camels laden with baskets of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, donkeys bearing jars of wine from the Levant, and merchants guiding wagons heavy with timber from Anatolia. The air is filled with the smells of dust, sweat, and spices. These are not mere luxuries, they are the lifeblood of empire, enriching the palaces, temples, and markets that depended on the ceaseless flow of trade. The traders themselves came from many lands. Syrian citizens worked alongside Aramean middlemen, Babylonian merchants, and men from as far as Egypt or Urartu. Languages mingled in the markets. Contracts were written on clay tablets in cuneiform or Aramaic. Coins, as we think of them, did not yet dominate. The system ran on weighed silver, on sealed jars of oil, on contracts recorded by scribes. A trader's reputation mattered as much as his goods, for trust was the invisible currency of long-distance trade. Caravans moved in groups for safety as well as company. Bandits haunted the edges of empire, and hostile tribes watched the roads. Yet under Assyrian rule, the fear of punishment kept most dangers at bay. Soldiers patrolled highways, fortresses guarded key mountain passes, and the sheer might of the Assyrian army made rebellion against merchants risky. For this reason, many traders, though perhaps resentful of harsh tribute, preferred to operate within Assyria's shadow rather than beyond it. Among the most prized goods was tin, essential for making bronze. Timber from Lebanon and Anatolia fed the construction of palaces and siege engines. Horses from the steppe-lands were brought to strengthen the cavalry, prized as much as gold. From further east, fine textiles, precious stones, and exotic animals made their way westward. While Assyrian craftsmen exported metalwork, textiles, and carved ivories, the flow was never one way. Each road was a meeting place where cultures and goods mingled, leaving faint but lasting impressions upon the empire. At the center of this network was Nineveh. The city's markets were legendary, its avenues crowded with merchants hawking goods under the gaze of massive palace walls. Here traders sought audiences with officials, paying taxes or presenting exotic gifts that would find their way into royal treasuries. Tribute, too, flowed along these roads: grain, cattle, or gold, extracted from subject peoples, brought in steady streams to satisfy the empire's endless appetite. Yet trade was not only material. Along with goods came ideas, stories, and beliefs. Myths from distant lands slipped into Assyrian culture, while Assyrian gods and symbols traveled outward. Traders became silent ambassadors, carrying the empire's presence into foreign courts, even when armies did not march. The spread of the Aramaic language, first as the tongue of traders, later as a lingua franca, was one of the subtle legacies of this exchange. Roads carried more than commerce. They carried culture. Still, life for the trader was not without hardship. Days of endless walking under a punishing sun, nights spent huddled against cold winds. The constant fear that a broken axle or lame donkey might leave one stranded far from help. In mountain passes, snow and ice turned the path treacherous. In the deserts, water was life, and every well was a blessing. Merchants relied not only on soldiers, but on their own endurance and cunning. A caravan leader needed the memory of a map in his head, where the next station lay, which tribe controlled which oasis, and how to bargain for safe passage. At roadside inns and caravanserais, life briefly slowed. Fires were lit, stories were exchanged, and bread was shared. Soldiers and merchants mingled here, each dependent on the other. A soldier might envy the trader's wealth. A trader might fear the soldier's authority. Yet both knew they were bound together, for neither army nor merchant could survive without the roads that carried them. Taxes were collected at these waypoints, a constant reminder that the empire did not tolerate free passage. Toll collectors watched closely, measuring goods, assessing values, and ensuring that nothing escaped the king's share. For the Assyrian state, trade was not only tolerated but harnessed, each wagon and donkey adding to the flow of wealth that built palaces and funded wars. The roads themselves became symbols of control. Where Assyria conquered, they did not merely plunder and depart. They laid down roots, imposed order, and made movement serve the empire's needs. In this way, the network of roads was as much a tool of domination as the sword. The image of the king standing over subject peoples, demanding tribute, was inseparable from the reality of caravans trudging along highways under the watch of Assyrian garrisons. Yet, for ordinary people, these roads also offered opportunity. Farmer might sell surplus grain to a passing caravan. Craftsman might see his work carried hundreds of miles to foreign lands. A villager near a trade route might find prosperity in providing food, water, or shelter to passing merchants. For them, the empire's reach was not only oppression, but a strange kind of connection. Binding their small lives to the fates of distant lands, over time, the roads became part of the empire's identity. They symbolized both strength and fragility. As long as goods flowed and traders moved, Assyria thrived. But should the roads falter, should enemies block passes, rebels seize stations, or rival powers divert trade, the empire would weaken. In this, one sees the quiet truth of Assyria's might, that armies won wars, but roads and traders sustained empires. So, when we picture Assyria, let us not think only of kings or soldiers. Let us also see the merchant guiding his camels, the scribe recording weights of silver on a clay tablet, the soldier standing guard at a dusty station. Let us hear the creak of wagon wheels, the jingling of harnesses, the murmur of bargaining voices in many tongues. These were the sounds of an empire alive, the steady pulse beneath the thunder of conquest. For in the end, the empire's greatness was not only written in conquest and cruelty, but in the countless journeys along its roads, journeys of risk, resilience, and exchange. And though Assyria's palaces now lie in ruins, the echoes of footsteps and wheels along those ancient highways remind us that empire is as much about the quiet persistence of trade as it is about the roar of battle. Part 8. Women, Families, Domestic Life. When the thunder of armies faded and the shadow of palaces retreated, life in Assyria unfolded in quieter rhythms, those of women, families, and the domestic world that sustained the empire's breath from within. Behind the walls of Nineveh, Calhu, and Ashur, past the grand gates carved with lions and winged guardians, there was another Assyria one that rarely left marks in official inscriptions, yet lived on in fragments of clay tablets, household ruins, and the faint echo of voices that carried through courtyards and kitchens. To understand Assyria, not just as a machine of conquest, but as a human society, we must step into this domestic sphere, where birth, marriage, meals, and faith gave meaning to existence. In this space, women carried roles that were both constrained and crucial. The laws of Assyria, particularly the Middle Assyrian laws preserved on clay tablets, made clear that women lived within boundaries carefully defined by male authority. Veils were reserved for wives and women of high standing. Slave women and prostitutes were forbidden from wearing them, under penalty of harsh punishment. Adultery by a woman could bring death, while a man's infidelity was treated with leniency. Yet within these constraints, women exercised agency. Queens, especially in the Neo-Assyrian period, wielded power not only as consorts, but as managers of estates, participants in diplomacy, and patrons of temples. The royal women of Assyria left inscriptions that recorded their gifts to the gods, revealing a quiet but potent sphere of influence. But beyond queens and noblewomen lay the countless ordinary wives, daughters, and mothers whose labor filled the homes and sustained the empire. Archaeology uncovers traces of weaving workshops, where women spun wool into textiles, one of Assyria's major exports, traded across Mesopotamia and beyond. In clay tablets, we find lists of rations allocated to female workers, sometimes entire groups employed in palace or temple industries. Women also played roles in agriculture, tending animals and crops in partnership with men, though their labor was often unrecorded in official accounts. Domestic life, for the vast majority, was a partnership rooted in survival, each member contributing to the sustenance of the household. Marriage was both a social contract and a sacred covenant. Families arranged unions that bound property, lineage, and religious duty together. Dowries were recorded meticulously on clay tablets, often including livestock, servants, or land. A wife's role was expected to be one of fidelity, childbearing, and management of the household. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that women could inherit property and, in some cases, control their own economic affairs, particularly as widows. The home, then, was not simply a site of female subservience, but also a place where women bore responsibilities that could shape the survival and prosperity of their families. Within these homes, the rhythms of daily life revolved around food preparation, childcare, and the maintenance of modest domestic shrines. Clay ovens, grinding stones, and storage jars found in excavations reveal a diet built around barley bread, lentils, onions, dates, and for those who could afford it, meat and beer. Meals were not simply nourishment, but ritualized acts of togetherness, reinforcing bonds among family members. Children grew up in these spaces, learning skills by watching their elders' boys, perhaps preparing for the fields or the army, girls for the loom and the household. Lullabies, stories, and protective amulets, carved with the images of household gods, reveal the tenderness of a world that coexisted with the harshness of Assyria's laws and wars. Children, however, were also bound by vulnerability. Mortality rates were high, and protective rituals were deeply embedded in domestic practice. Amulets of Pazuzatha, demon who could ward off illness, were hung near cradles. Incantations were whispered by women to protect infants from the evil eye or restless spirits. In these acts of quiet magic, mothers sought to shield their children from the invisible dangers that seemed to lurk in the air as much as from famine or disease. The supernatural was never far from daily life, and women often served as custodians of these protective practices, mediating between the world of the living and the unseen. Beyond the home, women also appeared in roles as priestesses and temple attendants. Some were dedicated to the service of deities, their lives shaped by ritual obligations rather than domestic duties. Others were trained as diviners or singers, their voices carrying in hymns that reached the ears of gods and mortals alike. The temple system allowed women to find identities outside of marriage, though such roles were bound by strict regulations. Inscriptions mention entire groups of female singers and lamenters, their voices woven into the ceremonial life of Assyria, where women carried collective memory, voicing grief, praise, and ritual that bound communities together. But if temples offered one path, servitude offered another, far darker. Assyrian conquest brought in countless captives, many of them women from subjugated lands. These women were enslaved, sold, or integrated into Assyrian households, sometimes as concubines, sometimes as workers. Their voices are the faintest of all, but their presence was pervasive. They tended the homes of their captors, wove the textiles that enriched Assyria's economy, and bore children who grew up in a world that might see them as both insiders and outsiders. In this way, Assyrian domestic life was not a closed unit, but one interwoven with the spoils of empire. For men, too, the home was central, though often interrupted by duty to the army or labor for the state. Husbands and fathers bore responsibility for the protection of their households and the continuity of their lineage. The patriarchal structure of Assyrian law placed men as heads of families, with authority over wives and children, yet also burdened them with obligations. Failure to provide, to discipline, or to guard one's family could be seen as shameful in a society where honor and order were prized. In this sense, the domestic realm mirrored the larger Assyrian ethos, strict, hierarchical, and bound by duty. Archaeological remains of homes in Assyrian cities give us glimpses of these dynamics. They were often built around central courtyards, with rooms opening onto this heart of the household. Courtyards provided space for cooking, weaving, and gathering, while side rooms served as sleeping chambers or storage. Water jars, cooking pots, and small altars suggest the blending of practical and spiritual life. The family home was not merely shelter, but a microcosm of the cosmos, a place where humans, gods, and spirits all had their rightful space. Festivals and community life also touched families deeply. The great state rituals in the temples of Ashur or Ishtar may have been distant for ordinary households, but local shrines and seasonal celebrations connected families to the larger rhythm of Assyria's sacred calendar. Women played roles in preparing offerings, baking ritual bread, or carrying torches in processions. For children, such events were moments of wonder, the chance to see the divine draw near, to feel part of something greater than the daily routines of grinding grain or fetching water. And yet, under this quiet life, the weight of empire was never absent. Taxes, labor demands, and military levies reached into the household. Families sent sons to the army, delivered goods to storehouses, or watched neighbors carried away into service. The domestic sphere was never isolated, was always touched by the larger mechanisms of control and conquest that defined Assyria. Still, families found ways to endure, to make homes into sanctuaries of stability amid the uncertainty of empire. In the end, it is perhaps in the resilience of these families that Assyria's truest legacy lies. Palaces crumble, laws fade, armies scatter, but the patterns of birth, marriage, work, and devotion carried on. Women weaving, men plowing, children playing in courtyards, elders whispering prayers, these ordinary acts bound the empire together more surely than the lash of conquest. They reveal Assyria not only as a realm of kings and soldiers, but as a society of households, where human beings sought continuity in the face of mortality. The clay tablets speak loudest of kings and gods, but between their lines, we can glimpse the invisible lives that made the empire breathe. Families, women, children, the unseen majority of Assyria kept alive the pulse of an empire that would otherwise have been only stone and steel. Their world was one of constraint, but also of care, as it is here, in these modest spaces, that the humanity of Assyria still flickers. Part 9. Slaves, servants, and captives. The other face of Assyrian society. Assyria was a land of kings, palaces, armies, and merchants. But it was also an empire built upon the backs of those who held no freedom, who lived in shadows, and who rarely left their voices in the official record. While inscriptions celebrated victories, decrees, and monuments to gods, another layer of society carried the burdens that made such grandeur possible. This was the world of slaves, servants, and captives, the silent millions whose lives reveal another face of Assyria. Their presence was as ubiquitous as it was hidden, woven into every layer of daily life, from palace kitchens to temple workshops. From farms along the Tigris to distant construction sites where laborers toiled under the eye of overseers, slavery in Assyria was not uniform. People could become slaves through conquest, debt, crime, or birth. The spoils of Assyrian campaigns regularly included vast numbers of human captives. Kings boasted of carrying off entire populations, uprooting communities, and resettling them in new lands. These deportations served political ends, weakening conquered states, repopulating Assyrian cities, and providing labor for imperial projects. Captives from lands as far as the Levant, Anatolia, and Babylonia were marched into Assyria, their identities dissolved into the role of enforced workers. Inscriptions speak coldly of such transfers, noting numbers like 20,000 people carried away. But behind each figure lay the pain of families broken, languages lost, and lives reshaped by exile. Servitude also grew from debt and misfortune. A farmer who fell behind on obligations might sell himself, his wife, or even his children into servitude to repay what he owed. Clay tablets record such transactions, treating human beings as collateral. Yet slaves were not always permanent captives. Sometimes they could work their way back to freedom or be redeemed by relatives. Yet the reality of such bondage meant vulnerability to exploitation. Households and estates absorbed these debt slaves, whose labor kept the machinery of economy turning. In the heart of Assyrian cities, slaves and servants filled both modest and prestigious roles. In palaces, they cooked, cleaned, carried water, tended gardens, and cared for animals. Some served as musicians, dancers, or attendants at feasts, adding to the spectacle of royal power. Others were scribes or administrator slaves, could sometimes be educated and entrusted with responsibilities, particularly if born within a household. In temples, servants prepared offerings, baked bread, and maintained sacred fires. The gods, like the kings, were sustained by invisible hands. For the wealthy, slaves were markers of status, evidence of a household's reach and resources. To own many was to display power, but it was also to integrate their toil into every corner of daily life. Life for these people was precarious. Laws such as the Middle Assyrian laws regulated their treatment with chilling bluntness. A runaway slave, if captured, could be mutilated or branded. Harboring another slave could bring severe punishment. Yet within this harsh framework, slaves sometimes carved spaces of endurance. Marriage between slaves was possible, and children were born into these households, their identities bound by the status of their parents. Some masters granted manumission, freeing long-serving slaves or those who had earned loyalty. Others allowed them to own small amounts of property, building fragile roots in the hope of eventual liberation.
Ow.
But such freedoms were exceptions. The rule was servitude. One of the most distinctive aspects of Assyrian rule was its reliance on mass deportations. Unlike simple enslavement, deportation uprooted entire groups and resettled them in distant lands. Archaeology and inscriptions confirm that these displaced peoples were often employed in building projects, irrigation works, or farming new lands. While this policy fragmented conquered societies, it also infused Assyria with a cosmopolitan diversity. Foreigners brought languages, crafts, and traditions into Assyrian cities. In this way, the empire's grandeur was paradoxically sustained by the very people it had subjugated. Yet, for the captives themselves, this blending was born of trauma loss of homeland, forced journeys, and the struggle to forge identity in alien soil. For women among the enslaved, life bore its own particular burdens. Many became concubines, their bodies appropriated as extensions of male power. Others were assigned to weaving houses or grinding mills, laboring long hours with little reprieve. Children of such unions could grow up in liminal spaces, sometimes absorbed into Assyrian households, sometimes marked forever by their enslaved heritage. The vulnerability of women reveals the most intimate dimension of conquest. Domination not only of land and labor, but of bodies and futures. Yet within this vulnerability, one can also glimpse resilient mothers who nurtured children, who whispered songs in foreign tongues, who sought to keep fragments of memory alive, even when their worlds had been overturned. In the agricultural heartlands, slaves and captives labored in fields, maintaining the food supplies that sustained cities and armies. Irrigation canals, so vital in Mesopotamia, were dug and maintained by forced workers. The expansion of Assyrian territory was inseparable from the redistribution of populations to these agricultural zones. These captives became the invisible spine of empire, feeding its people, enriching its treasuries, yet seldom remembered in its inscriptions. Every loaf of bread, every jar of beer carried within it the sweat of those who worked not for themselves but under the eye of another. Resistance, though muted in records, must have been constant. Runaways were a recurring problem, mentioned in tablets that describe rewards for their capture. Small acts of defiance delayed work, sabotage, concealment likely occurred, even if invisible to history. Communities of deportees, though displaced, may have preserved elements of their identity, passing on languages, customs, and beliefs in private spaces. The empire could dominate bodies, but it could not entirely erase the quiet persistence of culture. This endurance, however fragile, was itself a form of survival. We must also recognize that not all servitude was equal. A slave in a royal workshop might live more comfortably than a free peasant crushed by taxes. Some captives, skilled in crafts or administration, rose to positions of trust. The boundaries of status in Assyria were fluid, and power often hinged less on abstract freedom than on one's proximity to wealth and authority. Still, the overarching truth remained. Freedom was privilege. While bondage was widespread, shaping the lives of countless Assyrians and foreigners alike, when we step back, we see that the Assyrian Empire was not sustained merely by kings, generals, or scribes. Its foundation lay in the toil of those whose names were not inscribed in stone. The slaves who tilled fields, the captives who carried bricks, the servants who prepared feasts, these were the true lifeblood of empire. Their anonymity was deliberate, their silence enforced. Yet without them, the empire's palaces would have stood empty shells, its armies unfed, its gods unoffered. Assyria's greatness was built upon their invisibility. To tell their story is to widen the lens of history. Empires often leave us tales of triumph, glory, and monumental achievement. But beneath these tales lies the quieter truth, that power is carried by the labor of the powerless. Assyria's kings could boast of victories and palaces, but those victories were marched into being by captives, and those palaces rose on the backs of nameless workers. In remembering them, we see Assyria more fully, not only as a realm of domination, but as a society in which domination was daily. It's personal and constant. The other face of Assyria is not carved on reliefs, but it lingers in the broken bodies of laws, the ration lists of captives, the foundations of irrigation canals dug by unwilling hands. It whispers from the silence of those who did not choose their lives but endured them nonetheless. In their endurance, we find the deepest truth of empire, that every monument is also a monument to those who could not leave their own. Their absence is their presence, their silence, the loudest testimony of all. Part 10. Banquets and Feasts. The Theater of Power. If the silent work of slaves, servants, and captives sustained Assyria in the shadows, then the banquets of kings and nobles were the brilliant stage upon which that wealth was displayed. The empire's feasts were more than meals. They were spectacles of abundance, theaters of power, and sacred affirmations of hierarchy. To recline at a royal table was not merely to eat and drink, it was to participate in the drama of empire itself, where every gesture, every dish, every song is a symbol of the strength of Assyria. The Assyrians, like many peoples of the ancient Near East, considered banqueting a sacred act as much as a social one. Reliefs carved into palace walls show kings reclining upon couches, cups raised, musicians playing, attendants bustling around them. These were not private dinners, but orchestrated performances, designed to impress both the guests and attendants and the generations who would later gaze upon these images. Food and drink became extensions of authority. To eat at the king's table was to be reminded of who controlled the land, the grain, the livestock, the vineyards, and by extension, the lives of those who produced them. The preparation for such feasts began long before the first goblet was lifted. Palaces had vast storerooms where grain was measured, meat salted or smoked, and wine sealed in clay jars. Servants and slaves were tasked with maintaining these stores, fetching ingredients, and preparing the banquet halls. Kitchens buzzed with activity. Oxen roasted whole on spits, lamb stewed in fragrant pots. Fish caught from the Tigris or Euphrates simmered with herbs. Bread was baked in countless forms: flat rounds, twisted loaves, honey-sweetened cakes. Beer, the ancient staple, flowed in abundance, while wine, rarer and more prestigious, was poured for honored guests. Sweet fruits, dates, and figs were piled high, alongside delicacies brought from conquered lands, reminders that Assyria's reach extended far beyond its rivers. Banquets were occasions of scale as much as taste. A single royal feast might consume thousands of animals, dozens of amphorae of wine, and mountains of bread. One of the most famous examples comes from King Ashur-Nisirpal II, who, upon inaugurating his new capital at Kalhu, modern Nimrod, said to have held a banquet for nearly 70,000 guests. Inscriptions record the staggering provisions: 10,000 measures of beer, thousands of sheep, hundreds of oxen, countless birds, fish, and delicacies. This was not only hospitality, it was propaganda carved in stone. To feed so many was to declare in no uncertain terms that the king's resources and generosity were limitless. Music and entertainment transformed the feast into theater. Lyres, harps, and flutes filled the air with melody. Singers chanted hymns or heroic songs, celebrating gods and kings alike. Dancers performed in rhythm, their movements as much a ritual as an amusement. The walls of the feast hall gleamed with painted reliefs, torchlight flickering across carved lions, warriors, and gods. In such a setting, the senses were overwhelmed. Guests would recline, surrounded by sound, light, and abundance, their bodies fed even as their spirits were saturated with awe at the empire's might. Seating at such feasts was no casual arrangement. Where one sator reclined marked one's position in the social order. The king, often depicted reclining upon an ornate couch, was the focal point. Beside him might be the queen, her presence carefully staged to reinforce both domestic harmony and dynastic power. Nobles and high officials arranged themselves in descending ranks of privilege, while attendants moved constantly between couches, refilling cups, offering platters, ensuring no guest lacked. To sit closer to the king was to bask in reflected power. To sit further away was to know one's place. Even the act of drinking bore symbolism. Toasts were raised to gods and ancestors, to the prosperity of the land, to the strength of the king. Goblets, often of bronze, silver, or gold, glittered in the firelight. The raising of the cup was both convivial and ritual, binding those present together in a shared acknowledgement of Assyria's divine and royal order. Drunkenness, however, was frowned upon in elite circles. It was the balance between indulgence and dignity that mattered most. To lose control was to dishonor oneself in the theater of power. Feasts also served as diplomatic arenas. Foreign envoys might be invited, shown the magnificence of Assyrian abundance. For them, the feast was both gift and warning. The king, who could feed tens of thousands, could just as easily starve entire cities. Lavishness demonstrated both wealth and control. Be a guest was to be awed, to feel the weight of empire through the simple act of eating. Gifts might be exchanged, alliances sealed, treaties toasted, all in the glow of torches. Beneath the carved gaze of winged bulls and divine figures that adorned the halls, At the same time, these banquets reinforced the gulf between classes. For common Assyrians, daily meals were modest: bread, onions, lentils, beer. The grandeur of the palace feast stood in stark contrast, a reminder of the distance between rulers and ruled. Yet, in their own way, ordinary households also celebrated with food. Festivals and religious days brought larger meals, gatherings of family and neighbors, modest echoes of the royal banquets. But the scale and spectacle of the king's table remained in a realm apart, an unreachable height for most. The banquets were not only worldly, but spiritual. Gods were invoked, their statues sometimes present in the feast hall. Offerings were made alongside human consumption, reminding all that abundance flowed from divine favor as much as from human labor. To eat and drink was, symbolically, to share in the blessings of the gods and to affirm the king as their chosen steward. In this way, the feast became a cosmic drama, a union of heaven and earth enacted through food, drink, and song. Yet behind the glitter of cups and the smoke of roasted meats lay the hidden labor that made it possible. Captives who tilled fields, slaves who carried amphorae, servants who prepared dishes, these invisible hands fed the spectacle. The theater of power was constructed upon their toil. The abundance of the king was the absence of freedom elsewhere. Every loaf carried the shadow of its baker. Every amphora bore the weight of those who filled it. The banquet hall, for all its brilliance, is therefore both a celebration and a mask, concealing the inequities that sustained it. But to those present, dazzled by the abundance, such truths were distant. Guests would remember the music, the torches, the shimmering goblets. They would recall the laughter of nobles, the solemn toasts, the king's presence like a living god. They would carry away the impression of Assyria not only as a land of conquest and wealth, but as a realm of inexhaustible generosity. The memory of such a feast lingered, binding loyalty, inspiring fear, weaving itself into the fabric of empire. As the feast ended, torches dimmed, and guests drifted into the cool night. The palace would grow quiet once more. Servants cleared the remains, musicians packed their instruments, and the halls echoed with silence. But the impression remained. For the Assyrian elite, such banquets were not excessed. They were instruments, reinforcing order, binding loyalty, projecting power. They were, quite literally, the taste of empire. And so, in the shimmering glow of these feasts, we glimpse another side of Assyria. Not the sweat of the fields or the clang of the army, but the splendor of the palace table where food became language, drink became ritual, and the act of dining became the theater of power. Part 11. Assyrian Myths and Cosmic Order. As the torches of the banquet fade and the echoes of laughter drift into silence, another kind of theater begins to rise in the stillness of Assyria. But the stage of mythware gods, monsters, and cosmic struggles gave meaning to the rhythms of life. If banquets were the performances of earthly power, myths were the performances of eternal truth, shaping how the Assyrians understood themselves, their kings, and their place in the universe. Imagine yourself now in the quiet of a temple courtyard, the moonlight glinting off carved stone. The night is cool, and the murmur of the city has faded into sleep. Within the sacred precinct, priests whisper hymns and recite tales that are older than kings, older even than the cities themselves. These myths were not idle stories, but profound maps of existence. They explained why the sun rose, why rivers swelled, why empires rose and fell. For the Assyrians, myths were the threads that bound human life to cosmic order. At the center of their pantheon stood Ashur, the great god after whom the empire named itself. Ashur was not only a deity of the sky, but the very embodiment of the Assyrian state. His will was the empire's will. His dominion mirrored the dominion of kings. To serve Ashur was to serve Assyria, and to disobey the empire was to rebel against heaven itself. Myths surrounding Ashur were less elaborate than those of older Mesopotamian gods, yet his presence overshadowed all. Beside Ashur, the Assyrians inherited the rich mythic tapestry of Sumer and Babylon. The story of Marduk defeating the chaos dragon Tiamat, for example, echoed an Assyrian ritual. Though Marduk was Babylonian, the Assyrians adapted the tale to reinforce their own cosmic order. Chaos was always present, lurking in waters, deserts, or the rebellion of men. But order embodied by gods and kings would prevail. It was a reassurance that the fragile balance of existence could endure. One of the most enduring myths was that of Ishtar, goddess of love, war, and the morning star. In Assyria, she was both fierce and tender, patroness of warriors and guardian of fertility. Her myths told of descent into the underworld, of conflict and renewal. When she went down into the dark realm of her sister Ereshkigal, the earth withered, desire ceased, life itself seemed to halt. Only through negotiation and sacrifice did she return, bringing vitality back to the world. This myth echoed with the rhythms of agriculture, with the cycle of seasons, with the uncertainty of life itself. The soldiers marching into battle prayed to her for strength, while farmers sowing fields whispered her name for fertility. In both war and peace, Ishtar's story wove through the fabric of existence. Though the tale was Sumerian in origin, Assyrians copied and preserved it in their libraries. In the dim light of palace scribes, clay tablets pressed with cuneiform told of Gilgamesh's grief for Enkidu, his journey through mountains and seas, his failure to grasp eternal life, that power, conquest, and wealth could not shield one from death. The myth reinforced humility, even in the shadow of great empire. In temples, myths were not merely told, but enacted. Rituals often dramatized the cosmic struggle between order and chaos. Priests recited the creation epic, hymns rising in cadence, incense smoke curling toward the heavens. The audience, whether nobles, commoners, or captives, would listen, their minds transported to the time before time. These rituals were gentle reassurances that the world, for all its turbulence, was sustained by divine order. As the sun rose each day, it was not by chance, but because God's willed it so. The myths also justified kingship. The king was more than a ruler. He was the earthly counterpart of Ashur, chosen to extend divine order across the world. Myths emphasized this connection. To resist Assyria was to side with Tiamat, with darkness, with dissolution. Victory in battle, therefore, was not simply military triumph, but cosmic affirmation. The empire itself became myth, a living drama of divine will unfolding across rivers and deserts. Even household life bore traces of these stories. Clay amulets depicting lions, winged spirits, or the goddess Ishtar were tucked into doorways. Small figurines of protective deities, such as Pazuzu with his fierce, grotesque face, were placed in homes to ward off evil. When families told stories by lamplight, they repeated not only tales of ancestors, but echoes of divine myths, keeping cosmic order alive in daily rhythms. Myths were not distant. They were woven into the very breath of Assyrian existence. The Assyrians also believed that gods communicated through omens. A storm at the wrong time, a lunar eclipse, the birth of a malformed lamel could be interpreted as divine messages. Priests studied the skies, the livers of sacrificed animals, the behavior of birds. These divinations were framed by myth. Gods were not silent. They spoke through the world itself. The myths provided the grammar by which those messages could be read. To ignore them was to risk disaster, for the balance of cosmic order was fragile. Yet myths were not static. They shifted with empire's needs. As Assyria expanded, conquered peoples brought their own gods and stories. Some were absorbed, others adapted, a few diminished. The pantheon grew crowded, yet Ashur remained supreme, the keystone of cosmic order. This flexibility kept the empire's mythic foundation strong. Just as soldiers and traders carried goods along roads, priests and scribes carried myths, ensuring they reached from Nineveh to the farthest frontier. And still, beneath all grandeur, the myths whispered a simple truth. Life was fragile. Empires might rise, cities might gleam, banquets might dazzle, but the stories of gods reminded people that they were part of something vaster, something beyond walls and crowns. When storms swept across the plain, when drought threatened harvests, when armies clashed at the borders, the people of Assyria looked to myth, to the eternal stories that gave shape to chaos and light to uncertainty. Picture once more the temple courtyard at night. The priests have finished their chants. The incense has burned low. The moon slides across the heavens, a silent guardian. Somewhere beyond the city walls, farmers sleep. Soldiers keep watch. Captives dream uneasily of distant homes. But above them all, the myths breathe quietly, binding sky to earth, order to chaos, king to god, mortal to immortal. They are not loud or urgent. They are steady, repeating like the slow flow of the Tigris, reminding each soul that they are part of an eternal order. And so, after the spectacle of feasts, we find ourselves among stories gentler, older, more enduring than any palace banquet. In the myths, Assyria found its meaning, its justification, its comfort. For in the end, it was not only armies and palaces that held the empire together, but also the quiet power of story, the ancient murmur of gods and heroes, shaping the cosmic order beneath which all Assyrians lived. Part 12. The Fall of Assyria. When one thinks of Assyria, the first images that often rise to mind are those of strength. Colossal stone guardians, their wings outstretched, standing sentinel at the gates of palaces. Armies moving in endless ranks across the horizon, their shields gleaming in the sun. Kings enthroned beneath gilded ceilings, issuing commands that carried across the lands from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia. For centuries, Assyria seemed unshakable. To its neighbors, it was a pillar of power, a force to be feared, respected, and resisted. And yet, as with all human creations, time was stronger. No empire, however mighty, is beyond the reach of change. The story of Assyria's fall is not a tale of a single catastrophe, nor merely of one night of fire and ruin. It is the slower rhythm of decline, the steady weakening of foundations, the rise of enemies long held down, and the gathering of storms across generations. To enter this story is to walk with the Assyrians in their final years, to hear the fading echoes of their triumphs as silence approached. At its height, the Assyrian Empire was unmatched. By the 7th century BCE, under kings such as Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal, its power stretched across vast distances. From Egypt in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east, Assyrian armies moved with efficiency, enforcing tribute, crushing uprisings, and weaving together lands of extraordinary diversity. Its roads tied distant regions into a single system. Its palaces displayed wealth that astonished even foreign visitors. Libraries, gardens, temples, and fortresses filled its cities. To contemporaries, it must have seemed invincible, as if Assyria would endure forever. Yet beneath this appearance of strength lay fragility. Empires require more than armies to last. They require legitimacy, balance, and the trust of those they rule. In Assyria, these were wearing thin. The very success of conquest sowed the seeds of weakness. Expansion was not merely glory, it was necessity. The machinery of empire depended on fresh plunder, new tribute, more lands to tax. When conquest slowed, the strain deepened. Soldiers, once celebrated as victors, grew weary of endless campaigns. Farmers pulled into armies, left their fields untended. Subject peoples ruled harshly, simmered with resentment. To govern through fear alone is to stand on unstable ground. The moment that fear weakens, rebellion begins. Babylon, in particular, became Assyria's most persistent challenge. To the Assyrians, Babylon was both jewel and thorn. It was an ancient city, filled with prestige, home to traditions older than Assyria itself. To rule Babylon was to claim legitimacy. And yet, Babylonians were fiercely protective of their independence. Time after time they rose in revolt, unwilling to yield completely to Assyrian kings. Each rebellion demanded suppression. Suppression deepened hatred. The cycle drained resources and fostered instability. To control Babylon was to hold a prize, but it was also to grasp a burning coal. Meanwhile, beyond Assyria's borders, new forces stirred. To the east, the Medes, once scattered tribes, began to unite into a more formidable power. Skilled horsemen, mobile and ambitious, they looked westward with determination. To the south, the Babylonians themselves grew stronger, emboldened by leaders who dreamed of ending Assyrian rule. For centuries, Assyria had thrived because its enemies were divided. Hatred forged unity. The Medes and Babylonians found common cause. Their alliance, once unimaginable, became reality and together. They posed a challenge even Assyria could not easily withstand. Inside the empire, problems multiplied. After the reign of Ashurbanipal, remembered as the last great Assyrian king, civil war erupted. Succession disputes splintered the royal family. Generals vied for influence. Resources that might have defended borders were consumed by infighting. Provinces slipped from control. Governors wavered in loyalty, and the machinery of government faltered. It was as though a mighty tree had rotted at its heart, still tall, still imposing, but hollow within. Then came the blows that ended it all. In 614 BCE, the Medes struck at Assur, the sacred heart of the empire. To lose Assur was not merely to lose a city. It was to lose the birthplace of Assyrian power, the home of its chief god. For centuries, kings had traveled there to affirm their rule. Its temples embodied the link between people, king, and divine. To see Assur fall must have shaken the Assyrian people to their core. Did it mean that the gods had turned away, that the empire's destiny had run its course? The loss of Assur was more than strategic, it was spiritual, a wound in the soul of a people. 2 years later, in 612 BCE, came the decisive blow. The Babylonians and Medes joined in alliance, marched on Nineveh, the jewel of the empire. Nineveh was more than a capital. It was a wonder of the ancient world. Its walls stretched for miles, fortified with towers and gates. Its palaces shone with carved reliefs and vibrant decoration. Its gardens flourished. Its libraries contained the collected knowledge of centuries. To Assyria, Nineveh was proof of greatness itself. The coalition laid siege. For months the city resisted, but the pressure was immense. Ancient records speak of the Tigris River swelling and undermining the walls, of fires consuming palaces, of chaos and slaughter. Whether by flood, fire, or sword, Nineveh fell. Its grandeur reduced to rubble, its palaces to ash. The destruction was so complete that centuries later, people would forget where Nineveh had even stood. To contemporaries, its fall was unthinkable. For those who lived it, it was the end of the world they had known. The remnants of the Assyrian army fled to Haran, gathering there in one last attempt to hold their ground. For a few years they clung to the hope of survival. They were shadows of the past. By 609 BCE, Haran too had fallen. With it, the last organized resistance ended. After centuries of domination, the Assyrian Empire ceased to exist as a state. And yet Assyria did not vanish entirely. Its enemies carried away more than its treasures, they carried its influence. The Babylonians adopted military practices and administrative methods. The Persians, rising later, built upon the idea of empire itself, extending the Assyrian model across even vaster lands. Centuries later, the Romans would remember Assyria as one of history's great powers, a symbol of strength and ambition. Though its monuments crumbled, its ideas lived on. For the people who endured its fall, such legacies must have seemed distant, even meaningless. Imagine the child in Nineveh as the walls collapsed, clutching a parent's hand amid fire and noise. Imagine the farmer in Assur, watching smoke rise from the temple, wondering whether the gods still listened. For them, the collapse was not a lesson in history, but a struggle for survival. Families fled as refugees, wandering roads once guarded by Assyrian soldiers. Priests mourned the silence of their deities. Soldiers without orders became wanderers themselves. The empire that had seemed eternal was gone, leaving confusion in its wake. The silence of centuries deepened the impression of finality. When archaeologists in the 19th century rediscovered Nineveh and Nimrud, they unearthed colossal statues, winged bulls half buried in earth, and libraries of clay tablets preserved beneath layers of rubble. The ruins had been hidden so long that for generations, no one remembered where they lay. Assyria lived on only in fragments of scripture and story. That silence broken at last by the spade was perhaps the truest testament to its fall. And yet, from that silence, voices still speak. The clay tablets of Ashurbanipal's library, whisper of medicine, astronomy, prayers, and myths. Among them, the Epic of Gilgamesh endures, telling of humanity's search for meaning, the artistry of reliefs, the strength of walls. The structure of administration all remind us that empires fall, but human creativity continues to ripple outward. The story of Assyria's collapse is tragic, but it is also familiar. It's tragic because so much beauty, so much labor, so much devotion was consumed by fire and ruin. Familiar because history repeats such patterns again and again. No empire has been immune. Power dazzles, but time humbles. What feels eternal to one age becomes ruins to another. As we linger here at the twilight of Assyria, we are reminded of both grandeur and fragility. Its palaces, its armies, its systems, all could not withstand the forces of discontent, alliance, and the quiet erosion of time. Assyria believed itself eternal, yet it fell. In that fall lies a lesson, that impermanence is the only certainty. And so as night deepens, picture the ruins once more. The fires have long gone cold. The walls are broken. Silence blankets the stones where once kings walked. The Tigris still flows, as it always has, carrying water past what remains. Above, the stars scatter their light, indifferent, eternal. Assyria is gone, but its story lingers. Pass now to you. Let that story rest with you as you drift into sleep. A reminder that power is fragile, but memory endures. That nothing human lasts forever, and yet nothing human is ever wholly lost. Time erodes, and time remembers. And in that balance, there is peace. The fall of Assyria did not happen in a single night. Empires rarely vanish with the turning of a day, and Assyria so mighty, so feared, so deeply woven into the fabric of the ancient world was no different. Even after Nineveh was consumed by fire and Haran's walls fell into ruin, something of Assyria lingered in the lives of those who survived, in the memories of neighboring peoples, and in the quiet continuity of fields, rivers, and villages that had once been its lifeblood. The Babylonians celebrated their triumph. The Medes divided their spoils. But for the common people, the farmers, the craftsmen, the mothers and children, the weary soldiers, the fall was not a triumph at all. It was a disruption, a change of rhythm that unsettled the familiar world they had known. Empires collapse on the scale of kings and armies, yet their echoes stretch into the smallest corners of everyday life. Imagine, if you will, an Assyrian farmer. He once guided his cart along the broad, ordered roads that the kings had built. His grain moved swiftly to the markets of Nineveh. His harvest was counted, taxed, and measured by officials in robes of authority. His livelihood, though humble, was bound to the order of empire. In the years after the fall, those roads were quieter. The caravans came less often. New governors, foreign, unfamiliar, speaking words in strange tongues, appeared in place of the old officials. The farmer's life did not end, but it shifted. Continuity remained, of course. Seeds still went into the soil, and harvests still filled his baskets. Yet the air of certainty, the feeling that the world was anchored by the gods and the power of Assyria, seemed to dissolve into mist. The rhythm of daily life continued, but it carried with it a quiet unease. The priests, too, faced their own bewilderment. For centuries, kings had raised temples to Ashur, to Ishtar, to Shamash. Victories in war had been proclaimed in their names. Conquests were justified as divine will. The very identity of Assyria had been tied to its gods. But what did it mean when the sacred city of Assur itself lay in ruins, its temple burned, its statues carted away by conquerors? Did the gods abandon their people, turning their faces away in disappointment? Or had the people in some hidden way failed the gods? These questions, whispered in the hushed corners of sanctuaries, unsettled the faithful. Religion, once the anchor of empire, became a source of doubt. And yet, rituals still continued. Offerings were still made. In the face of silence, people sought meaning, as human beings always do. Survivors adapted. Assyrians did not vanish overnight, nor could they. Their language, Akkadian, lingered for generations, whispered from parents to children. Their crafts, fine carvings, durable pottery, intricate weaving continued, sometimes under Babylonian patronage. Families carried on traditions in new forms, blending with those around them. When later empires rose, the Persians, the Greeks, the Parthians, people in those same lands, still bore names that reached back to Assyrian roots. They still tilled the same earth, drank from the same rivers, and prayed under the same sky. The great empire was gone, but its people endured in quieter, humbler ways. For outsiders, the memory of Assyria lived on with shadows in Babylonian records, and later in the writings preserved in the Hebrew Bible. Assyria was remembered as an oppressor, an empire of cruelty and conquest. Its armies had marched into Israel. Its soldiers had deported populations, shattered kingdoms, and boasted of their power. The very word Assyrian became, in some stories, a symbol of arrogance, a warning of unchecked might. Yet centuries later, others would marvel. They would see not only cruelty but accomplishment. Canals and aqueducts that shaped the land. Libraries that preserved ancient knowledge. Reliefs that captured scenes of life, war, and ceremony in remarkable detail. History rarely grants a simple verdict. Assyria was a destroyer, yes, but also a builder, an oppressor, and yet an innovator. Its legacy was as complex as the empire itself. In the 19th century, long after Assyria's story had slipped into half-memory, archaeologists began to uncover its remains. Western visitors were astonished when enormous winged bulls with human faces rose again from the soil, their stone bodies intact after 2.5 millennia. Palatial reliefs emerged, showing kings in splendid robes, or facing lions in ritual hunts. The grandeur of Assyria, once reduced to myth and scripture, returned to view stone by stone. For centuries it had been a name spoken in passing, a shadow of history. Now it was real again. The rediscovery of Nineveh, Nimrud, and other cities reminded the modern world that human ambition, artistry, and pride even, when buried deep beneath earth and time, can survive. Among the greatest finds was the library of Ashurbanipal, preserved in the ruins of Nineveh. Thousands of clay tablets, etched with cuneiform writing, revealed a world of knowledge, texts on religion, medicine, astronomy, history, and literature. Within them was the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale older even than Assyria, telling of a king who sought immortality, only to find wisdom in the fleeting nature of life. That such texts endured surviving fire, conquest, and centuries of silence may be Assyria's quietest gift to us. Not the noise of battle or the roar of kings, but the endurance of words, of stories, of knowledge, carried forward across ages. What then do we learn from the fall of Assyria? Perhaps the most enduring lesson is the fragility of power. However strong an empire appears, it remains bound by human limits, by exhaustion, by discontent, by the shifting sands of alliances and betrayals. Assyria believed itself eternal. Its kings carved their names into stone, proclaiming divine favor and unshakable strength. Yet within just a few years of Ashurbanipal's death, the empire collapsed. History whispers the same truth again and again. Nothing built by human hands lasts forever. But there is another lesson too, the endurance of culture, memory, and story. Assyria's political order crumbled, but its influence stretched far beyond its fall. Later empires borrowed its systems of rule, Later artists echoed its style. Later scholars preserved its texts. Even in destruction, continuity remained. This dual truth that power is fragile, but memory endures makes the story of Assyria not merely a tragedy, but a mirror of the human condition itself. Now let us imagine the ruins, long after conquest. The fires have cooled. The soldiers have moved on. Silence blankets the shattered walls of Nineveh. Only the wind whispers or an owl cries across the empty streets. The Tigris River flows nearby, carrying its waters as it always has, indifferent to human rise and fall. Stones that once supported kings' palaces lie scattered, darkened by time. And beneath the soil, clay tablets wait. Inscriptions endure, memory lingers. Time erodes, but time also preserves. For you, listening now, perhaps on the edge of sleep, Assyria's tale is both distant and near. Distant because its world lies millennia away, with languages no longer spoken and gods no longer worshipped. Yet near, because its themes are as human today as they were then: ambition and fear, power and loss, collapse and survival. Empires rise, people struggle, stories endure. In listening to Assyria's fall, you listen also to the rhythm of history, the rhythm of humanity itself. Picture, if you will, the night sky over ancient Mesopotamia. The stars scatter across an endless dome. Beneath them, the ruins of an empire rest in quiet. Once, those stones echoed with the cries of kings, with the marching of armies, with the prayers of priests. Now they echo only with silence, the silence of time, silence of peace. Assyria fell, but its story remains. And tonight, you carry that story too, gently woven into your thoughts as you rest. May it remind you that nothing is eternal, yet nothing is ever truly lost. Time erodes, but time also remembers. In that balance between forgetting and remembering, between loss and endurance, there lies a kind of calm, a kind of peace. And so, let the story fade now, like the last glow of fire against the night. Let the ruins rest, let the river flow. Let the stars watch silently, as they always have. The empire has fallen. The story is told. Now it is time for sleep.